In Jesus' time on earth, the general attitude toward the poor seems strange in a world where the vast majority of people weren't particularly well off. By and large, the typical Jewish citizen in Roman occupied Israel didn't own much wealth. Perhaps that's why it was so important for the people to consider themselves better than the impoverished. Jesus' teaching humanized the poor and demonstrated God's incredible concern for their well being, and in doing so, decried those who ignored or disenfranchised them. The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. Luke 4:18a. Looking at his disciples, he said, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God." Luke 6:20. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. Luke 14:13 and 14. In first century Palestine, a woman's social sphere was only as large as her family. Jewish writings made it clear that it's the way of a woman to stay at home, and it is the way of a man to go out into the marketplace. While literacy was an important element in teaching young men to study the Bible, it was a luxury for women, because the Old Testament was explicit about teaching scriptures to sons. Women were excluded from instruction in the Torah. It wasn't normal for a man to speak directly to a woman. Not only do the Gospels show Jesus speaking to women, it depicts him doing so with an element of tenderness. He doesn't simply heal the woman with a bleeding disorder. He calls her daughter. When he addresses the woman doubled over from spiritual oppression, he calls her a daughter of Abraham, conferring on her a spiritual status equal to her male counterparts. Not only did Jesus allow his ministry to be largely supported by the financial offerings of women, but it was to women he made his first post-resurrection appearance. In an era of gender segregation, you'd be hard-pressed to find an example where Jesus treated men and women differently. Much of the Old Testament was concerned with purity. One could become unclean through exposure to potentially contagious diseases or body fluids that could carry disease, or from eating unclean foods. Once someone was unclean, they had to avoid sacred spaces and duties until they could be purified. To be unclean was to be socially ostracized. Lepers were one of the largest and most stigmatized unclean groups. It didn't help that leprosy was a horrible, disfiguring disease. They were cursed with terrible disease and the loneliness of exclusion. In Mark 1:40 through 45, Jesus is approached by a leper who wants to be healed of his affliction. The shock in this passage comes in Jesus' response to the man's request for healing. Jesus doesn't just heal the man, he touches him. Holy people avoided lepers entirely lest they become unclean themselves. Jesus' response towards the man, who probably hadn't known physical touch in a long time, displayed a humanizing kindness. We see the same kind of gentleness in the way Jesus responds to the woman who had been bleeding for 12 years. This bleeding would have made her unclean, yet she takes it upon herself to touch him. His response isn't to berate her for making him unclean, but to compliment her faith. The well-documented hatred between the Samaritans and the Jews dated back for centuries. That's why the author of the Gospels and Acts were so enamored with documenting Jesus' discussion about this group and their exposure to the gospel itself. When Jesus told a teacher of the law that loving his neighbor as himself was an important part of fulfilling the law, he asked Jesus who was his neighbor. Christ's response was a completely startling parable with a Samaritan as the hero. In another story that pits Jesus against both racial and gender discrimination, Jesus ends up alone with a Samaritan woman at the local watering hole. The discussion covers some of the misunderstandings that exist between Jewish and Samaritan worshippers, while displaying a sincere concern for this woman. In the end, this discussion results in the conversion of many Samaritans. We're all in this together. There's no room for hatred of others in the Christian faith. In fact, many have suggested that God has a preferential option for the poor. Regardless of one's theology, I don't believe we can be more Christ-like, more Christian, when we stand with the oppressed. Yes, we're all in this together. Standing with those who are oppressed because they are poor. Standing with those who are oppressed because they are a woman. Standing with those who are oppressed because of their race. Standing with those who are oppressed because they are sick.